Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last.
You will know end this morning. Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Your pain shall be laid.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Now, Frostborn, you will know end this morning.
Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers.
I'll make sure you suffer. Now, Frostborn, I'll make sure you suffer.
At last. This is more like it. For the
Our
Lich
brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool.
Glory to the Scourge.
At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last.
Faithless coward. Your pain shall be laid.
Finally. For the Lich King. At last. This is more like it.
Faithless coward.
Finally.
Our
Frostborn
brethren's town is under attack.
This is more like it. At last.
First blood.
Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Glory to the Scourge.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Now, Frostborn. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
Hello.
What is it now? No one orders me around. Finally. What is it now? This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Our brethren's
This
town
is
is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last.
You will end this morning.
This is more like it.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For the Lich King. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it. Now, Frostborn. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. last.
See me in action.
What is it now?
Our brethren's town
This
is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn
Our
hungers.
brethren's town is under
For
attack.
the Lich King. I'll make sure you suffer. Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last. For the Lich King. Frostborn hungers.
Our
Finally.
brethren's town is under attack.
At last. No
Our
one orders
forces
me
are under
around.
attack.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. What is it now?
Our brethren's
Finally.
town is under attack.
Your pain shall be legendary. No one orders me around. At last. This is more like it. At last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Glory to the scourge.
Our brethren's town is under
This
attack.
is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? At last. This is more like it. I'll make sure you suffer. Frostborn hungers. For the Lich King.
Our brethren's
At
town is
last.
under attack.
I'll make sure you suffer. Your pain shall be legendary. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. Now. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. At last. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. What is it now? Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. You will know endless. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. I'll make sure you suffer. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Tread lightly. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. This is more like it. You will know endless for the Lich King. I'll shoot you suffer. Tread lightly. Finally.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
You will know endless. At last. What is it now? This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This
Our
is more
brethren's
like it.
town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
Your pain shall be legendary. Our brethren's town is under attack.
This is more like it. At last. Speak, fool. What is it? Tread lightly. Finally. This is more like it. Now.
You will know endless.
Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary.
This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Our forces are under attack.
No one. Tread lightly. This is more like it. No one orders me. Frostborn.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last.
How may I serve?
What news?
Speak, fool.
I have read my calculations.
Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's
This
town
is
is
more
under
like it.
attack.
For the Lich King. Faithless coward. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's
Finally.
town is under attack.
This is more like it. For the Lich King. This is more like it. At last. Faithless coward. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Tread lightly. What is it now? This is more like it. Tread lightly. Finally. Now. Fingers help. At last. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. I'll make sure you suffer. At last. Finally. This is what no one orders me around. At last. This is more like it. At last.
Dominating.
What is it now? At last. Finally.
Glory to the Scourge.
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Finally. At last. Finally. At last.
Double kill.
Frostborn hunger. This is more like it.
Dominating.
Finally. At last.
Killing spree. Faithless cover.
Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Tread
Greetings,
lightly.
my lord.
What is it now? Tread lightly. This is more like it. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Tread lightly. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Speak, fool. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hunger.
Glory to the Scourge.
This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally.
Double kill.
No one orders me around. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally. Hungers. What is it now? At last. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Fine. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne. What is it? Tread lightly. At last. Frostmourne. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last.
Mega kill.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Finally. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Now, at last. Frostmourne hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. Finally. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. At last. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. Speak, fool. I'll make sure you suffer. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. Finally. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Now. This is more like it. Finally.
Glory to the Scourge.
This is more like it. This is more like it. What is it now? Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Faithless coward. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers.
Thy bidding, master.
What is it now? This is Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Glory to the scourge.
Now, Frostmourne.
Glory to the scourge. Glory to the scourge. Monster kill.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Finally. For the Lich King. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
Guide me.
Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread lightly. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. What is it now? Speak. Tread lightly. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. This is more like it. Now, Frostmourne. At last.
Glory to the scourge.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last.
Godlike.
At last.
Killing
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Double kill.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Speak. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
You will know end of that.
This is more like it.
Faithless coward.
What is it? Was Lich King. Now, Frostmourne. This is more like it. Finally. For the Lich King. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. I'll make sure you see. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Glory to the Scourge.
This is more double kill. At last.
Triple kill!
Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers.
Glory to the Scourge.
At last. Tread lightly. Finally. Speak, fool. At last. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. What is it now? At last.
Where shall my blood
No
be
one
spilled?
orders me around. This is more like it. Now, at last. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it. No one orders me around. What is it now? Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Now, Frostborn. At last. This is more like
Our brethren's town is under attack.
At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. No one orders me around. Finally. At last. For the Lich King. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. What is it? This is
Glory to the Scourge.
at last. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
You will know endless torment. Fate's counter.
This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
You will know endless torment.
At last.
Fate's counter.
Finally.
Glory to the Scourge.
Frostborn hungers.
I'll make sure you see.
This is more like it. Finally. At last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
There's no time to rest.
How may I serve?
Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
My bidding, master.
No one orders me around. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary. I'll make sure you suffer.
This is more like it.
Double kill.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. No one orders me around. Finally. For the Lich King. Ah, at last. Finally. What is it now? This is more like it. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me. Speak. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Now. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
You will know endless.
This is more like it. Tread lightly.
Our brethren's
No
town
one
is under
orders
attack.
me around. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. What is it now? This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Now, Frostmourne.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. Frostmourne hungers.
Our
This is more
brethren's
like
town is under attack.
At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Finally. No one orders me. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At
Our
last.
brethren's town is under attack.
Speak, fool. Lich King. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Now, Frostmourne. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. What What is it now? Finally. At last. This is more like
Your pain shall be
at last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. What is it now? Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. At last.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers.
Killing spree.
At last. Speak, fool. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally.
Greetings, my
Give
lord.
me something to do.
I am ready.
What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our forces
Frostmourne
are under
hungers.
attack.
No one orders me around. What is it now? At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread lightly. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. No one orders me around. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last.
You will know end this torment.
This is more like it. Finally.
Fate.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
You will know end this torment.
Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally.
Your pain shall be mitigated.
This is more like it. Ah, at last.
I wish only to serve.
This is
Hello.
finally. This is more like it. Finally. What is it now? Speak, fool. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. Finally. What is it now? At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. I'll make sure you suffer. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Tread lightly. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. Finally. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. At last. No one orders me around.
Glory to the scourge.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is
Our brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack. Our brethren's town is under attack.
finally. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. This is more like Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
Our forces are under attack.
This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. Ah, at last.
Killing spree.
Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. At last.
Killing spree.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Killing spree.
No one orders me. Finally. This is more like it. For the Lich
Our brethren's town is under attack.
at last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Glory to the Scourge. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
For the Lich King. At last. Frostborn hunger. Finally.
Our
Frostborn
brethren's town
hunger.
is under attack.
This is what Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool.